Everybody, welcome to New 302. It's the 11th of February, 2021. And today, we're lecturing on a couple things, but this first lecture is about fathers. This week is on fathers and sons. It's not just on fathers and sons. The idea is to talk about the father energy generally. And of course, the father energy, right? One's father complex, it makes an impact, whether you're a son or a daughter. But fathers and sons is a particular kind of relationship and a particular kind of focus, right? Like mothers and daughters. On that note, of course, both fathers and sons and mothers and daughters were originally slated to be prior to Family Day, which is coming up on Monday. The explicit thing being that there's a bunch of material around Family Day and Valentine's Day, which immediately precedes it, and how that stuff relates. And so it's often useful to review some of this material in advance of that. However, we got pushed back a week, so it's not a big deal. Now, fathers and sons and mothers and daughters sort of bracket around reading week, and maybe you can sort of lens through reading week and Family Day and Valentine's Day and see what you can get as we go from one to the other. That also is a note, obviously. Next week is reading week. We don't have class. Also not office hours, et cetera, et cetera. So try, if you can, to carve some actual time off for yourself. I understand, of course, everybody is underwater. And, there's just a tremendous amount of work, everybody is saying. I know you guys have a lot of work, a lot to catch up on, midterms, tests, assignments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I do suggest that if you can, in any way, shape, or form, try to carve yourself 3 days, right? Try to carve yourself 3 days. Okay, so as I mentioned, fathers and sons, and moving over and talking later a little bit about the Manticore. The first thing that I'll say is that as I was sort of considering lecture earlier, I was, going through a sort of a variety of texts, and there's sort of less in the Jungian literature on fathers than there is on mothers. Mothers they turn up, but they're sort of, they're highlighted, and fathers turn up, but less frequently. There are a few key things. There's some important material in the so-called sort of mythopoeic movement. And so you get books like Iron John, which had a lot of currency, right, which is about masculinity in general and sort of initiation. There's a few books like that, which I've read. And there is the sort of interesting catalog of masculine archetype, which is, what is that book called? Magician, Warrior, Lover, King. Magician, warrior, lover, king, warrior, magician. It is those 4 things. I'm just trying to remember the order. I believe king is last. Magician, warrior, lover, king. That sounds right. Anyway, that book, which is by a couple of authors, also does some interesting stuff in and around sort of male archetypal expression. I wanted to consult my copy of Aspects of the Masculine, which is sort of a sub-selection of Jung, and I showed it to a student recently and a client. I was like, this is the book you're looking for, and held it up, and now it's scurried off and gone to hide. So I don't know where it's gotten off to. I've checked stacks and piles and shelves, and the pile beside my bed and the pile beside my desk, and I can't find it. It's hiding from me. So I didn't get a chance to specifically go in and pull some of the sections out of that, but I was also looking at Hellman, Senex, and Puer, and some of the selections out of Psychological Reflections, which is one of the collected work anthology books, which is useful. So, fathers, dads. Of course, before we are sort of the beings that we think of ourselves, even composite and complexity and so on and so forth, we're social beings first, right? And this is something obviously that we've discussed in sort of the natural way that we form our complexes and project them, right, pretty naturally, is that we're deeply social beings, right? We internalize and run other people in our head, but we also send our head out onto other people, right? And we sort of bind together our social world and our mental world in that way. And you know, being as we're sort of naturally social, right, even very young infants will sort of orient onto the human voice and the human face, right? In fact, there are things that barely resemble a face that a human infant will sort of preferentially orient itself towards, pay attention to. And infants often sort of preferentially pay attention, or they differently pay attention to qualities of voice, right? So there's lots of stuff on how babies will orient towards deeper voices and less deep voices, right? And the obvious connection, you know, here is that, you know, voice depth tends to be a secondary sexual characteristic. Obviously, there are ranges of such things, but voice depth tends to be a secondary sexual characteristic, you know, when it's secondary to testosterone. And therefore, you know, the idea that's typically drawn from this research is that, you know, what children are doing is orienting differently to men and women. And it's interesting, you know, kids at a relatively young age develop a certain kind of wariness around the masculine, a wariness around men. Beards, in particular, are known to sort of weird kids out, right? They're a little bit dangerous. And that's perhaps not surprising, given our evolutionary background as primates. Most primate males carry with them a pretty serious kind of danger quality to them, right? We're the rare species where the male statistically is larger and more heavily muscled. That's a primate thing. Not that many species went that way. But for us, it carries that kind of quality to it, right? And so, you know, babies will orient differently in different directions, and they early on will sort of start to fill their environment up in this way. And this is what we've talked about around complexes. They'll start to fill their environment and tag and catalog things. And the concepts of mother and father are some of the first concepts that get laid in, right? Mother is first. Without mother, there is no survival, right? But soon after that, it's father, and father has a different kind of quality. And let's be clear, right? Somebody's individual complex can be filled not just with one's biological father, but with other male figures, right? But also with the sort of imprint of the masculine that's carried by the mother. If it is the case that the father isn't there, right, then the mother will fill that space, especially for sons, right? She'll fill that space with her ideas either about the person or with her own father or with, right, sort of cultural notion and projection, right, her own dreams. That space will be filled regardless, right? And people will take an imprint regardless. And it'll, you know, be present in the mother if the father's not around. If the biological father is there, that's typically a huge source of it. But uncles, family friends, right? And after a certain point, things like teachers too. It's pretty common for people to have teachers or coaches or, right, other kinds of significant figures, pastors for many people, will start to fill in this kind of role. And all these things start to collect into this idea of, you know, sort of the role of the masculine and its place in the world. Fathers are interesting in the way that they do not bind as closely, in some sense, okay, as the mother. The mother image, right, as I mentioned, it's like the mother image is sine qua non. One literally emerges from the mother, right? One's health and welfare are typically completely dependent on the mother in some way, right? You hear the mother's heartbeat, you hear the mother's voice, right? You may drink the mother's milk. Like you're tasting and smelling the mother at close quarters, often for long periods of time. And the father is a somewhat more distant figure. He comes and he goes, right? Even if he's sort of present very often, he's not there in quite the essential way. He is an outsider at some level, right? And that's often exacerbated by cultural roles, you know? So for many people, their fathers are not even kind of a continuous presence, right? It's not uncommon. Certainly in the 20th century, right? For fathers to get up early, go to work, work all day, come home, but like maybe after the kids have gone to bed. That's not uncommon. Now, obviously, right? These roles are a lot more shifted up now, and also people are at home, but many of them, right? So, you know, it's a different situation, but for many people, this is the case. Even if the mother is working, the mother is more present, more primary, right? This is the supermom problem. Mom is trying to juggle the whole space. And none of this is invariable. People are going to have different experiences, but to speak in general terms. So the father is often, only around on the weekend, and or sort of in a more limited way, right? Often in a more limited way. Fathers and mothers both, they have that pervasive, right? They're like a field that extends through a space. And for our parents, and not just what they say, but how they are, right? This stuff gets coded directly into our assumptions about the world. I've said before, right? This is a sense in which Freud is right, that we internalize our parents before we form our own self-image. Our parents precede us within our mind. And as such, the things that carry in with the parents when we internalize the image, their views of the world, the way that they operated, the way that the values, right, that they carried were implied in their action. All of that stuff is baked in beneath the development of your own personality. It becomes part of the assumptions. It filters into the foundation of things in often a very unquestioned way. The father and the mother, in that sense, they form this strong, powerful, right, primary kind of framework that requires separation out from, because otherwise we can't sort of question some of these assumptions about the world, right? We can't question that assumption. So the father often has that absentee quality about them. They're not always there. And for many people, it's also the case that even when father is there, father is, distant in one way or another, right? Father might be emotionally absent, right? He might be really unhappy. He might be highly critical. He might be, particularly, hurt himself, right? And we, regardless, are going to absorb that quality, right? I heard it said that we have a need that exceeds merely just being loved. We also need to be enjoyed as kids, right? Which is to say that we need to feel that people take a pleasure in our presence. And if that is not present, we can feel loved, but not feel like we were ever sort of appreciated for ourselves. And that, likewise, it can bake into our assumptions about what the world is going to get from us and what we're willing to give it, right? When I was a kid, it was still the done thing, Father's Day was typically kind of close to the end of the school year, right? And I mean like a little kid, we're talking about junior and senior kindergarten and maybe grades kind of 1, 2, 3. Young. And so, Mother's Day is in May, Father's Day is in June. And typically it was the case that, it was just kind of towards the end of the year, but did get captured within the school year. And so, like most of these holidays when I was little, of course, we would make crafts. This was sort of clearly a very primary way to get us to do something. Is there any kind of special occasion at all? We're going to give you cultural knowledge and we're going to do a craft. So Mother's Day, of course, had all kinds of potential symbolism attached to it, right? In some ways, it overlapped significantly with Valentine's Day in its symbolism, right? Hearts, this sort of thing. And there might be certain kinds of symbols, but it tended to be pretty broad. Hearts, flowers, right? Making people flowers, paper flowers, that kind of thing. You would do all sorts of different crafts for Mother's Day. But one that I remember being pretty consistent when I was a kid for Father's Day was you would make a tie, a picture of a tie, like a necktie. And likewise, it was for a long time, less so now that the dominance of the tie, thankfully, has been somewhat released. I like wearing a tie, for the record, but I don't want to wear one all the time. To give your father a tie was supposed to be the Father's Day gift par excellence. That was like the Father's Day gift. Now think about that for a second. It's a very persona piece, for one thing, a tie, or making a craft of a tie, which is like, right? But it's even more direct in a way, symbolically speaking, because you're like, this isn't even a tie. I'm just signifying ties at you, right? I'm giving you a paper tie made out of construction paper and glue, right? Or cards that are shaped like ties. like this is a particular kind of link, right? That's supposed to be expressed about what it is to be a father, to have a tie. Okay, now, never mind that it's never been the case that everybody wore a tie, but you can see how this is drawing from this earlier era, right? The people that wore the ties to work every day, which used to be extremely common, right? And there's this link in that to work, to being at work, to being out and being active in the world, to being a breadwinner. Now that stuff is considerably eroded, right? But the echoes of these things are typically long. You know, we're still interacting, each of us, with traces, in a sense, of experience that were, you know, passed down and down and down, right? Echoed through a kind of like game of telephone oral tradition within our own families. We always get echoes of this stuff, even and maybe particularly if our parents do not speak about their own parents, right? Their relationship with their parents is present in their relationship with us. And their parents' relationship with their own parents is present in their relationship, you know, down and down and down. The stuff echoes. It's not hard if you look around in your family, obviously, to see signs of that continuity, right? Lots of people now will talk about intergenerational trauma, right? And there seems to be some pretty strong scientific evidence for it, but just in general, sometimes it's not hard to see how an echo sort of passes down the line. So even though it's not as current, maybe a symbol, there's still something very powerful about this link between the tie and the father as work, the father as an outsider. Okay, what else is a father, really quickly? Fathers very often are the parent who is the roughhouser, right? If he's playing. Dads are ticklers. Dads are teasers. Dads are throw the babyers, right? Oh, some babies love that, right? Dads are sort of generally considered, you know, like if you're a toddler and you throw a punch, it's a very different thing to clock your dad than it is to clock your mom, right? Your father's supposed to take it at some level. Fathers are not always, right? All of these are speaking in general terms, but fathers have that quality. They have the aggression attached to them, typically, right? They have the aggression attached to them. But aggression in that playful way. The idea is that the father is aggressive, but the father is kind of a master of strength. Now, as I said, right, it's not that we're just talking about the one's own biological father. There's a lot of things that can go in here. And we've already talked about how that typically tends to interface, sort of clinically speaking, right? You get transference, you get a projection that turns up very, very often in therapy. So, you know, everybody talks about therapy when it becomes an object of sort of sexual transference, right? The desire of a patient, right, experiencing attraction towards the therapist, or vice versa, right? The countertransference element. But often that gives way to a different kind of thing, right? That does happen sometimes, but it often gives way to a different thing. And the different thing is the parental projection. This is pretty well known, right? Now, we go through lots of parental projections. Anytime we hit a kind of role model type figure, we project. We reproject because we think that there's something to absorb there, something that we're not getting, right? Something that isn't, in a sense, already part of the system, right? Something that we didn't absorb. So, you know, we will have many encounters of this kind where we encounter somebody and we get, you know, just like a fatherly energy, or we realize that we're behaving in a way that is like either similar to how we behave with our own father, or similar to how we wish we behaved with our father, right? Or wanting them to behave how our father behaves towards us. And you do see that in analysis, right? I've shared my own example before, but just to reiterate, fairly early in my own analysis, I would say within the first 5 months or something, I'm sitting in the waiting room. It's hot, very hot. It was a hot summer. I'm sitting in the waiting room and I'm thinking, oh, like it's so hot and it's stuffy. Like it would be nice if we could have this conversation, but like, you know, someplace with some air, someplace a little ventilated. I mean, it'd be nice if we could, like, I don't know, just sit and have a beer and talk, or, you know, like grab lunch, or, you know, go for a walk, or, you know, go to the park and throw a ball around. And the second that thought passed through my head, I caught it right away because I was like, throw a ball around? Like it's a very particular and structured kind of symbol, throw a ball around, right? And the thing is, I'm not much of a throw a ball around kind of guy. I don't know if you have necessarily, would have guessed that, but I'm not a super throw a ball around guy because I'm in a family that isn't a super throw ball around family. I don't think I've ever thrown a ball actually with my father. I threw a ball with my grandfather. It was never something he wanted to do. It wasn't really something I wanted to do either. But here I was, and I'm having this thought about my own analyst, right? Throw a ball around. And so I caught it right away. And I immediately thought, oh yeah, like, okay, good. We've moved into parental projection. And having caught it, I think I caught a lot of that before it got out of hand, right? Because at the end of the day, he's not my father, right? He's not my father. There's a relationship there, but that's not what it is. And that particular kind of projection is doing a thing. It's trying to glom on, it's trying to fit. And it's like, no, it's not that kind of thing. You have to sort of re-encounter it in this other unique way, not take it to try to work out things. Now, the Freudians, of course, claim that that is actually a huge part of the work, that what the therapist does in this moment, right, is take the projection and in so doing, help the person deal with their transference, right? It's in the field. But also it's possible for that to attach in a way that is not healthy, not useful. Now, you'll notice that this is the same mechanism as other projection. It's the same as with romantic projection. We project and we reproject and we reproject and we keep projecting on people until we can either find sort of an object that matches, but then break through it and have an authentic relationship, or until we can pick up the patterns of our own projection, right? Until we learn that it is not a feature of the world. It's not about the people, right? That the similarities that you're dealing with repeatedly in your relational situations are coming from you, right? That they're coming from you. And that's not to say that they're your fault, right? It's a dynamic. It's not that kind of thing. But the point is, it's like, you hit the bunch of a scenario a bunch of times and you gradually are learning to tease apart which parts of it are coming from you and which parts of it are actually in the world, okay? Same thing with a projection like this. So, if you take kind of all that together, in a sense, you take the father, right, as this figure who is kind of present but kind of absent a lot of the time, not as central typically to children. And you pick up the traits, right? What does the child see when they see the father? Well, they see a kind of giant, right? Towering figure, possibly maybe a bit menacing, hairy, deep voiced, right? And typically like really, really enforcing of its privacy or loud. If, the father was really unhappy, right? Really, really unhappy, then the father may be a source of fear, right? And that's not to say that the mother can't be. Of course they can be. But, the father may be a powerful source of fear, right? But it's tangled together with this love and respect. Or sometimes it is the case that the father, and, call back to the Odyssey here, but it is the case that the father is sort of valorized. So he's not a dad anymore. He's a hero, right? This sometimes literally happens, say, with like dads that are coming back from, like a military tour, right? Coming back from war, where the sort of elevation of the father into a heroic figure occurs, and sometimes despite the difficulties that the father is having in connecting. Distances everybody, distances the father from the family, right? How can they connect? But it distances the family. How do approaching a hero is not easy, right? Living up to a hero is not easy. Okay, so the presence of the father image pretty necessarily entails, right, the presence of the child image, right? To be in relation to the father, right, unless one is in close association with it, is to be in the position of the child, right? It pushes in this particular developmental way. And when we're talking about fathers and sons, right, one of the things we're really concerned with is the question of this transition. How does the child grow, right? How does the child become the man, right? Become the father. And it's something where, depending on, right, what the personality relation is between the father and the son, you can have a lot of blockage, right? People do not accept old age very gracefully in our society. They don't want to do it, right? They don't want to do it. People cling to certain aspects of their being, certain modes of being. They want to stay the boss of the meal. They want to stay the king of the castle. They want to continue, right, to exert the kind of force, to have the weight to throw around. But the thing is that psychologically, right, there is always this position where the son is going to have to somehow pull something from the father that they can associate with, but in a way that doesn't absorb a bunch of the traits that don't agree with them morally, right, while also making something of themselves, right? Which means very often, frankly, winning the approval of the father. That question in general of approval, right? This is a bit of a callback to be enjoyed, not just to be loved, but to be enjoyed, right? That question of approval is often super central to people's images and material around the father, right? I've mentioned many times, there are sort of two questions that I basically always ask, always, every time I'm getting involved in sort of, getting to know somebody, a client, and thinking about a case, formulating a case. I always ask question one, where's the trauma? There's always trauma. The trauma may be of different scale, different scope, whatever, but there's always trauma, period, right? Where's the trauma? And the second is, how do you get the love? How do you get the love? What are the rules? What are the rules in this family? How do you get approval? What wins you approval? How do you get the love? But part of what I'm saying when I say that really is also like, what is it that won you, what is it that won you acknowledgement as a being of your own, right? What is it that won you acknowledgement as a being of your own? When were you acknowledged as kind of great, right? See, sometimes it's the case that the only way to get the love is to follow the rules, right? My house, my rules, right? If you're under my roof, whatever. Like, this is the way things are done. You either do things the right way or don't do them at all. I'm trying to think of other like classic dadisms without going into dad jokes, right? These are the sorts of things, right? That people often hear around their fathers. And so the idea is that, right, one sort of conforms, one does their duty, one plays their part, right? Especially for young men, right? You're supposed to thread, right, a set of kind of complicated mutual identities. Everybody has to. But in this particular case, like, a lot of it is coming down, and it's not uncommon to get sort of two different threads of information here, right? One, what the parent is telling you, and the other, right, how they're behaving, because, right, and who they are, who they have chosen to be, what they're concerned with, what their struggles are, right? Kids absorb that. The words, of course, land too, and they can matter. But what matters much more is behavior. And, that question of how do I get approval, but also how am I praised when I am doing my own thing? Or how am I praised in that way, right? How do you get the love? So, there is this like conformity, performance, doing your duty, etc. aspect that comes in a lot of the time. But then sometimes the question is like, to what extent is your own individuality being paid attention to? Right? To what extent is your own individuality being paid attention to? To what extent is the things that you care about pushing through the envelope and being paid attention to? Right? Are people asking you about why you're making that collection? People asking you what you're into? Are you just getting the question, how was school today? Right? Are you being treated with a kind of curiosity and an interest? Are people taking an interest in what's really going on with you? Not merely performance metrics, right? Not merely sort of superficial, ability to like work down the chore checklist, right? But really like what's going on with you, what you're thinking about, what you're caring about, what you're struggling with, what you're passionate about, right? That's the question. Like, is this stuff being paid attention to you, or are you being paid attention to as your own person and found to be delightful for being your own person, right? So people's relationships with their fathers very often, right, are shot through with a significant amount of that material where the father is not fully present in some important way. And some of that is, lots of pan-cultural material, right? You know, feelings and fathers aren't supposed to go together or something, right? Or you're not supposed to be sentimental, you're supposed to man up, or, you know, whatever, raising the kids is women's work, or, you know, whatever it is. Now, some dads are really there. They're really present, right? And sometimes they're present in ways that, you know, don't match up with the expectations in some sense, but the effort is there. It's possible to understand the behaviors of the father as being like, oh, well, that really does demonstrate care. It's like, why didn't you just say it? And it's interesting, right? People say this a lot, that why wouldn't he just say it, right? The kind of direct expression of sentiment is something that people often report, right, being blocked in and around their father, and as always, sometimes around their mother. But I see it a lot more with people and their fathers, right? Not knowing how to have an in-depth conversation, not knowing how to connect in some sense. Now, this is kind of like middle grade, loosely connected father, you know, a slightly disapproving father, a slightly authoritarian father, you know, a slightly disinterested father, a slightly non-present father. But, you know, there are obviously cases where one's father image is powerfully impacted by, right, behaviors from the father that are, you know, straight up tyrannical or monstrous, right? That's sometimes true. And then someone's imprint in this area, again, it carries all that behavioral thing. Even worse, if there's a huge split between words and deed, because then, like, what does that do? It just peels apart your trust between these two things, right? But there are tyrannical fathers, controlling fathers, the fathers that clench their fist shut and they don't want anything outside their control, right? Often wounded, I add, right? But when you're dealing with the consequences of it, it's a different thing. There are angry fathers, right? And, you know, it's often the case that the father is sort of deemed to be more generally frightening by kids, and the father is also often, you know, the deliverer of punishments, you know, sometimes physical, sometimes not. That often falls to the father. It used to be a cartoon when I was a kid called Wait Till Your Father Gets Home. That was the name of the cartoon. Right? And it was meant to be an indication that's like, when your father gets home, you're going to get it. That was the thing that, you know, I think is less the case now, but it's still probably quite present, right? Think about that phrase, wait till your father gets home. This is, you know, the mother typically in the space saying, like, you have no idea, there's a storm front coming, you know? That's kind of what she's saying, right? She's like, oh, you're going to get it, but I will not mete that punishment out. No, you will be dealing with the far more terrible force of the grandfather. That's what she's saying. So wait till your father gets home. This is like, you know, dread, even good dad images. And we've had a rough stretch of time for good dad images, you know. Cosby was a good dad image. And look what that turned out to be made of, right? So some distrust here. But, you know, you look at good dad images, you look at Word to Cleaver from Leave It to Beaver, or you look at, I'm trying to think, where would people's dad images be pulled from now? Sitcoms are always a really interesting source, actually, of this kind of stuff, because sitcoms, you know, like to boil things in a type. But sitcoms have become a bit wacky. Who's a solid dad figure? Tom Hanks is a solid dad figure, right? It's like a solid cultural dad figure. A lot of people respond to him in that way. Yeah, culturally, it's been a rough time for this kind of thing. You can look at different characters, think about them. You know, think about sort of archetypal dads as they turn up in our culture, and without looking at sort of mythology or fairy tale, although they're interesting in those contexts too. But like, where do we see the dad writ large, right? Where do we see versions of dads that are like, yeah, that's a dad. Consider that. So people may have, right, experiences with the father that are, like I said, tyrannical or monstrous, right? Or deeply, deeply conflicted in one way or another, right? It may be the case that the father, for instance, is extremely wounded and not, you know, not basically able, you know, doesn't really seem to have the surplus energy, right? Their psychic energy is just invested in holding themselves together and sorting out that stuff. But then they've got no energy to pay. They're not paying attention, right? And that can be deeply wounding. And the desire then is to figure out what it is. How do I meet that? How do I get its attention? How do I get its approval? When I said off the bat that parental energies, right, tend to sort of infuse the foundation of our biases, right? They act as just like a pre-conscious filter in a very strong way that's hard to tease out. That means that they tend to generalize into our relationships with domains of the world, right? And so what are those domains of the world? Well, they say, right, if you watch how a man treats his mother and you watch how he treats his partners, you'll understand his stance towards the world, right? And there's something about that. If you consider it for a second, it's very interesting, right? It's a very interesting idea, right? There's something about that generalizes outward. The same thing to some extent, okay, is true. Like, look at the relationship to the father and what is it? And then try to generalize that out into whatever domains the father is. What's the masculine energy for that person? What is it that stands in for? What's the domain? What does the father rule? And then their relationship to the father will tell you a lot about their relationship to that domain. Now, how people react to that can be quite different. It's possible, right? Some people prefer to steal fire. Some people prefer to rebel, right? Both are, of course, examples of resistance, right? This is like, I'm going to take this from my father and have it, right? To steal fire for myself, right? But without sort of dealing with the relationship as a whole. Pull certain kinds of traits. Often that forms something that's slightly competitive, right? You can sort of outfather the father, that there is this competition aspect. Sometimes it's the case that people push off. I'm not like my father and I'm never going to be like my father, right? It's often not uncommon for that kind of action, right, to sort of repeat and iterate itself, right? As I've mentioned before, people often swing quite wildly in the closeness of their parental ties. That's sometimes the case that people, have a really strong tie that doesn't, easily shake. It's a really central tie. And some people end up distancing their ties with both parents, some direction. But the point is, a lot of the time, what you see is a swing. At one point in life, somebody is close to this parent, and close to meaning like that's where their emotional connection is. It's also where their identification is, right? That's kind of where they're emulating, consciously or unconsciously. And then at some point, it'll swing back, right? In antiadromia, it'll swing back. It'll swing back, and when it does so, it demonizes, typically, right? So if you watch, people will do a thing sometimes where it's like, the mother is good, the father is bad. Nope. Now the father is good, but the mother is bad. Oh, nope. And they'll go back and, right, gradually sort this out as indeed they begin to sort out the material that they're going to use to, right, incorporate into themselves, to construct themselves. Because shocker for Jung, as with all such sort of dilemmas of the collective and, like attachments to the collective, the answer is individuation. If you, become yourself and consider these things in a conscious way, then you become who you are. And then your relationship to it changes. You're not just being whipped around on the end of a cord of projection. Okay. So tyrannical fathers, monstrous fathers, disinterested fathers, right? Cool fathers, absent fathers, right? I mentioned already a father, never having met your biological father, even if you were by some, fluke raised in an entirely female household with no other, male figures around of any significance at all, the imaginal material is going to fill that gap. And it's going to come through, your mother or the other women around you. It's going to come through culture. It's still going to fill in. It's still going to bricolage itself into something that you're interacting with. And if, when people come to that and they say, oh, I have a lot of things to say emotionally about this parent, and I have nothing to say about this parent, right? I don't know. I just don't feel anything there. Typically, it's the case that means that it's just really not conscious, because of course there's feeling there. How could there not be, right? Think about it. How could there not be? So if the feeling is not sort of obvious, that's usually a sign that it's more baked into the bedrock, that it's more baked into these fundamental biases in various ways, right? So often there's a harder work there, right? There's the one parent who feels like radioactive, right? Elicits strong reactions of one kind or another, right? And then another parent that's sort of like numb in a sense, or just like just there, or is an unquestioned aspect of one's own psyche, right? And very often that, there's complexification that needs to occur. Things need to be complexified and differentiated, pulled apart, right? The person is not being experienced sort of in a human way at that point, usually. For fathers and sons, there isn't really, as I've mentioned before, a framework for initiation in our culture. This is what's supposed to happen, right? The son becomes the father, and so on and so forth, right? There's supposed to be initiation. It's supposed to be the case that we have a ritual that says, now, right, you are, fit to be part of the community of men. And traditionally speaking, right, it's not sort of localized to our culture by any stretch, right? Our era or our culture, that dads, fathers tend to have sort of less role in the lives of children. In fact, if anything, kind of cross-culture, and there are always going to be exceptions, but if anything, cross-culture at large, fathers mostly interact, right, with sons when sons begin to enter into the field of space that is the field's natural, right? The father's natural field, It's like you're old enough to hunt now, right? You're old enough to make things. Now you're old enough to something. And there's this passage over. That's typically what initiation is actually intended to do. Create a ritual framework and a ritual passage so that the childhood self is sacrificed, right? And the adult self steps forward with the rights as a real member of the group. And it's not that there isn't a special connection with the father or things to learn, right? But it's like when you are ready to step into the field of participation of the men's world, that's what you're doing. That's what initiation is. It's the passage through into this world. And that's where the father has been all this time. All this time when he wasn't at home and da-da-da-da-da, where was he? He was off in this field, right? The realm of the spear, the realm of the tie, which looks a lot like a spear, actually. That's interesting. I wouldn't want to overextend that symbolism, but it's kind of interesting. The tie is decidedly sword-like if you sort of look at it. Anyway, this is the field. This is Zeus who hurls the lightning, right? From on high, always looking down, doing very important things. I don't know where he is. He's off doing important things. Telemachus, where's Odysseus? He's doing important things. My father's very clever, actually. He was instrumental in the sacking of Troy. Yep, that whole horse thing, my dad. That was my dad. Right, where is he? He's on his way home. Are you sure? It's been a long time. Yeah, he's on his way home. He's on his way home. Right? But he's not here. He's not here. The image is here, but he's not here. So he's off doing something important. He's flying around, doing important stuff, doing hero stuff, doing God stuff, doing lightning throwing stuff, doing tie stuff, doing tool stuff, doing automobile fixing stuff. That's a remarkably common association that people have. There is a real association between fixing and mechanics and machinery. What else gets associated with dads? Here's a weird one. I have a friend that wrote a really great paper on this, but barbecue is in North America. It's a male role. And it's interesting because what it did was carve a space out in what was predominantly, like a woman-dominated activity. It was predominantly female cooking, right? Cooking was female. Cooking was something that happened. The family was fed. The father brought home the bacon, but it was the mother, the women that actually did food preparation, but not with barbecue, right? Barbecue is a constructed idea in that sense, this idea that the men are the ones who have to grill the meat over the fire. This is an outgrowth of suburbia. It really didn't exist prior to that. My friend's paper on it was really quite interesting. He wasn't looking at it primarily archetypally, but of course, obviously that's right. For our particular purposes, that's the lens, we're looking at. So here we have him, and he's sort of caveman-like, He's wearing a primitive garment tied onto his front with straps to keep blood and sauce from not splashing onto his tie. And here he is with, savage weapon-like tongs and flippers, right? Metal implements in hand, flames before him, smoke, and the animal, right? Barbecue. What else? Catch. A very interesting game, as I mentioned, throw a ball around, not particularly part of my association, part of many people's association, the throwing around of a ball. The throwing around of a ball is an interesting thing. It's very directed. It's very active, right? It's very active. But catch is kind of a weird game, right? A game of catch. It's not like you win at catch. You don't. This is, I think, why catch is so often used as a symbol in films and things, why it resonates with people. Because a dad and a son playing catch is an image of two people that are engaged in something where they both get to demonstrate skill, but nobody's keeping score. You don't count in catch. You're not trying to slip one past them in catch. You're trying to get it to them. You're trying to get it to connect. You're both trying to get it to connect. If you play catch and you just take the ball, you whip it as hard as you can, put it over the fence, right? You have not done what you're doing. You're supposed to throw it to them. You might vary it up. You might put a side spin on it, maybe throw it a little longer, go long, right? Come short. Okay, here this one's coming in low, right? But the point is you're throwing it to them. You're throwing it so that they can catch it. And if they don't catch it, you're not like, boom, 1 point. That's not what happens either, right? It's an activity and it's very physical, very projected, very directed, very hurl the lightning, right? But the whole point is for the other person, the son, generally, to catch the lightning and then throw it back. That's an image that we have of sort of a healthy relation there, right? When we think about the symbols that we have of less healthy relations, they're typically what? Competitive, highly competitive. If there's competition between the parent and the child, that's a problem. And you see the same thing, obviously, with mothers and daughters, and you can see it between, in some sense, right, crossing over, father competing with daughter, mother competing with son, but not so often. This is one of Freud's great insights around this, right? He boils this down to, in some sense, kind of the first tagged archetypal complex, right? The Oedipal complex. And what's the Oedipal complex? It's the idea that you want to possess the mother, and that you are in competition with the father, and you must slay him, else he castrate you, right? Else he remove your own ability. And probably that's hyperbolic. I think Freud literalized that a little too heavily. But I think it does capture something, which is this competitive aspect. If you look at the literature, the number of men who report being jealous of their children is quite high. You do get cases of mothers being jealous of their children too, if they're receiving attention, but it doesn't seem to be as common. Men very often report that when they have children, they feel that they receive less attention from their wives or partners, right? Less sexual attention, less emotional attention, less priority. This can be really hard for them, right? For obvious reasons. And of course, in some ways you're like, well, yeah, of course, the kids require, but our feelings are not always so rational about how they respond to this. Sometimes they just hurt. And the fact that we tell them like, well, we need to be more reasonable about this, right? There's the quality of fathers that really are taking an active line with their kids, with their sons, right? And that active line can go a few ways. It can be that tyrannical thing. It can be a state of enforcement, right? And it can be a desire for the kids to have what they didn't have, right? That's a pretty common one. I want you to have what I didn't have, so I want you to do this thing that is not what I did. This is, there's a classic quote on that, actually. Yeah, here we go. Sorry, this is from, it's from Psychological Reflections, but the quote, and you've probably heard this one, is, nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parents. right? That's 115, page 115 in Psychological Reflections. The unlived life of the parents, right? In the same way as we sometimes say, you know, the military is always preparing to fight the war that they just fought, not the war that they're about to fight. All their preparations are sort of reflexive reactions to the war that just happened, right? Not what's about to happen. The same is true generally. And in that sense, right, fathers who are sort of like, I need you to do this thing, right, because I want you to have what I didn't have, are fighting the war that they just fought, right? They're refighting their own war. And there are cases, obviously, where that's going to transfer in some ways, right? You know, you can see a situation where perhaps if a father grew up in a household that was like abusive, physically or emotionally abusive, they may make the decision to push off from that, right? I'm not going to live in that place, and I'm not going to let my children live in it. I won't bring that here, right? So they can push off of it, and that can be sort of positive in some ways. But they may also be pushing off not what impacted them, but rather what they did not become, right? The aspects of their own life, which their own action, right, affected in certain ways. And that's different. That's different than pushing off against the things that affected them, not their own choices and things, right? Now, sometimes, of course, it's possible for an adult, for a parent, for a father, right, to have made some kind of terrible choice, you know? And I'm limited, honestly, in my sort of general acknowledgement of what constitutes a terrible choice. I think we don't know. I think we don't really know. Sometimes maybe it's obvious, but the thing is that we don't really know until the story wraps up, right? We don't know until the end. We don't know what the weight or value of any particular thing is necessarily until the story wraps up. We don't know. How could we? Things could reverse. They could change. Something can seem to be quite useless in a story and turn out to be very crucial, right? That's a twist that in stories we like very well. And it's a twist that in our lives we're often surprised by, but it does happen. Oh, I thought that was useless. It turns out it's not useless. It was actually kind of useful. I just had to figure out what to use it for, right? So, you know, in some cases, it's true that, you know, the unlived life of the parent, right? You know, living through their kids by proxy, living through their kids by projection, the father sort of like attaching to certain aspects of the kid's behavior, right? Maybe the father has had a stymied aspiration, you know, I don't know, to be an athlete, to be a businessman, to be a lawyer, to be a doctor, to be a something, whatever it was. And instead, right, the kid ends up carrying it forward. And if they're lucky, they're attuned to it and aligned to it. It turns out they're enough alike that actually it's a good fit for them. But if they're not, right, they get squeezed into a mold and a mode of being that isn't natural for them at all. And the payoff, of course, is the dad will be proud, right? And maybe even if you know that he's proud and you know that he loves you, he'll say it. And maybe even if he's saying it, he'll show it, right? He'll demonstrate it. You'll know because you'll know, right? Beyond any shadow, it will be finally clear to you in some way, shape, or form. And that's a moment where you get to step fully into the tribe. It's very common, remarkably common, these days for young men to put off having kids, right? People have been having kids later and later. They put off having kids. But it's also become very common, and it's interesting. It's become very common for young men whose fathers die to have a family and kids shortly thereafter, like really shortly, like within a few years. And in some ways, you can sort of see, you know, why the imminence of death in your father would catalyze you to kind of get moving. Oh, I don't have all day, right? And also like, wow, like he's gone and now I am one. And do we extend the line? Like it's on me now, right? These are the sorts of thoughts that occur to people, but a lot of it's unconscious. a lot of it's unconscious, right? It just operates under it. And all of a sudden people suddenly find their priorities changing, their desires changing, what's salient to them changing. And all of a sudden they find themselves being like, okay, I'm ready for something more serious now, right? Okay, I'm going to step up and sort out my career or whatever. Sometimes they've got that sorted and it's family. It's like, okay, I'm going to get serious about this now. It's a thing that they do. Or, right, they lean into it and lean into the project. But it's almost like there's no space in the room for two fathers, right? That the presence of their own father served as a blockade against being able to move into that energy themselves. You know, and sometimes that's true. If parents or grandparents or great-grandparents live a long time, they can cast a long shadow, even if they're nice. Even if they're nice. But if they're not nice, often it casts a very long shadow, right? Where things are sort of operating in that orbit. Okay. So that was sort of a whole host of things. I will say, I suppose it measures as reflections and will, in a sense, inform the second bit of what we're talking about when we're talking about the manticore and we're talking about some of the stuff. I recognize that, you know, this is a sort of a very broad scattering of material. And I'm drawing in many cases here, without naming names, on sort of my client situations, right? Obviously, things that I hear, things that I see, and drawing on my own experience to some extent, both like as a son, but also with other people. You know, I have a lot of friends with kids. I have a lot of friends interacting with their sons and watching how this works, right? And of course, it's something that I discuss with a large number of people, right? What their relationship was like with their father. And sons and fathers, it's a charged field. For me, it was a very charged field. I won't get into this in tremendous depth, but you know, there's a lot to work out there. And I definitely have fallen into the category of, you know, going into analysis and talking at enormous length about my father, my feelings around my father, my issues with my father, the way that I'm like or unlike my father, how I'm trying to be like or unlike my father, you know, the differences with my father, and then have my analyst say, you know, what about your mom? And I'd say, oh, we're good. My mom, she's a saint. She's a saint, right? So, you know, I definitely had my own set of progressions here. And my relationship with my own father has changed quite a bit. It's very different than it was, although in some ways there are similarities, right? My relationship with my father is very lopsided, for instance, which is to say that my father loves me and he's demonstrative of that love in some ways. There are things that he has done in my life that when I reflect on them, I reflect on the enormous care that's sort of made evident by them. You know, I was once taking my mountain bike to visit a girl in a town that was like a 45-minute bike ride. Or no, sorry, it was like 45 kilometers. So anyway, it was a long bike ride, like 3 hours. Okay. And this was not something I did a lot. So I went to visit this young woman in this town. I biked there. And as I was biking back, you know, I spent the day with her. And as I was biking back, my father knew what my intention and timing were. And I called before I left this town. I'm biking back and I'm just exhausted, right? I'm dehydrated. My legs are killing me. But I'm tired. I'm literally falling asleep on my bicycle on the side of the highway up on the Grey Bruce Peninsula. And as I'm kind of nodding off, barely able to kind of hold it together, all of a sudden, a car pulls in ahead of me, pulls over the gravel shoulder, and it's my dad. And to do this, he would have had to bomb out the highway, like he would have. It wasn't a request on my part. It wasn't an expectation either. I was expecting to have to ride home, right? It was like my thing. But I was just about to kind of tank out, and my dad showed up. And he would have had to like look for me. It's not a short thing, you know. In some ways, it's a small thing, but it mattered to me a lot. Like I conked out in the car, and I slept for like 7 hours on the couch afterwards. My legs were killing me. But there are things like this, and I think, right, for that to happen, my father had to care. He had to pay attention. He had to care. He was paying attention to my individuality. He was trying to support my efforts, right? He was being supportive in that way. But by the same token, it has sometimes been the case that my father has been, as they say, right? Everybody is self-centered, but the The radius of the circle differs. So, my father's a bit narcissistic. He's very wrapped into his own stuff. And my father's a very cool guy. He's interested in a lot of cool things. He was always into cool stuff, cool cars, cool motorcycles, cool music, cool books, cool science fiction, cool toys. My father was a wealth of cool stuff. My father's cool, right? But the flip side was not always the case, right? My father was not that interested in what I was interested in much of the time. And you can see there's a kind of tension, there's a kind of imbalance there. So I don't want to sort of over disclose in this area, but think about it a little bit. The motions that I have gone through as I've sort of processed my own material with my father have taken me through a lot of different stages. It's certainly not resolved by any stretch. We're sort of acknowledged to be closer in the family than my father's closer to me than he's closer to anybody in the family. And he identifies more closely with me than with anybody in the family. And that's all pretty recent. It's like mid-20s is when I broke through that. By making him a mix CD, I add. That was the thing that finally flipped my dad from we're different to we're the same. I made him a mix CD of MP3s with 100 MP3s. And when he listened to it, he said, "Oh, this is really good." And I said, "Yeah, Dad." And he was like, "Yeah, but every song is good." And I said, "Yeah, I picked them to be good." What do you mean? And he was like, "Yeah, but every song, I like every song and it's good." And I was like, "Yes, that's what I picked them for." But see, for my dad, he's experiencing his own inner emotional state of what he likes. And what does he see? He sees somebody is like me. Somebody is like me. That's how I crossed through the barrier. But you see what I did. I mean, it was my own selection, but also it was by appealing there, right? Okay. I'm going to wrap that up because that's an hour, basically. But this is a set of reflections, obviously. Sit with it, process it, right? Think about it. Think about your own relationship in this respect, but also think about the relationships of people you know. Really sit and think about it. What's that person's relationship with their father like? What's that person's relationship with their father like? What's that person's relationship with their kids like? Categorize it. Think about it in terms of the fiction. And then the second half, we're going to continue on with this line, but also we're going to talk about Robertson Davies and the second book of the Defford trilogy, The Manticore.